Right. So we have resolved this sprint anim override issue. Now it can sprint properly and the upper body is playing proper animation now. But we found this issue where when we make a sudden movement, which is when we are pivoting, it's again disorienting the equipped weapon, right? Something like this. Plus, when you are stopping, for stopping actually it works properly, but for pivoting and for some sudden movements, sudden transitions, it's disorienting, right? So let's resolve that today. Okay. So the solution I think is quite straightforward. So all we have to do is basically uh, implement the anim overrides for pivot cardinals and stop cardinals accordingly at our anim graph, right? So currently we have used these cycle cardinals and start forward facing cardinals. I don't think we have used these start cardinals, stop cardinals and pivot cardinals yet, right? Okay, so let's use those stuff. So yeah, we have this anim overrides layer blends for cycles, and similarly let's copy and paste those stuff for pivot as well. Pivot, and let it to here, right? And as the anim overrides, I don't need the cycle cardinals. Instead, let's use pivot cardinals. And also, I don't need this one here. Therefore, let's simply copy, duplicate it, and I'll rename the new function as pivot anim layer. And instead of using cycle cardinals, let's use pivot cardinals. Right, then let's go back to the pivot state, and instead of using update anim override cycle, let's use update anim override pivot anim layer. Compile and save. Then let's go to our dt anim set, and I'll start testing with rifle. So for rifle, we have the cycle cardinals. So similarly, let's copy the entire fields and paste it to stop, not the stop, pivot as well. Right, now let's see. Okay, now I'm sprinting. Okay. Right, I think that's not pivoting. In order to test the pivoting, we have to make our character as strafing. So let's go to the player blueprint, locomotion system. Instead of rotation mode as forward facing, let's use strafing. Okay. Well, it works properly, but yeah, it's sliding. Okay. Right, that's because of pivot A and B. Okay, let me see why. Right, so I debug it and I think I found the issue. Basically, like what happened is, like when we are sprinting, it goes to the pivot state properly, via these pivot sources by applying these transition rules. But once it reaches to this pivot state, ideally it should go to this cycle state in order to play the cycle anim again and again, but it doesn't make the transition, I guess. So what we can do is we can further improve these transitions to make that trigger happens, right? So one obvious naive way of doing that was simply adding a transition like this, and we can simply make this one as priority order 4 and automatic rule based transition. Right, and if I do that, let's see how it works. Right, so pivoting works, and no, it doesn't go to the cycle state. Right, so we can't do that naive approach. Instead, what we can do is yeah, because we have already added this automatic rule based transition at the transition rule 3. Instead, let's go to the transition rule 2 and add another logic. Right, maybe we can, do we have the variable to get the last pivot time? Yeah, we have. So let's see where we implemented this one. Yeah, this one is basically initializing at the setup pivot anim layer and update pivot state function. Right. Give me a second. Let me see. Right. So let's check whether we have a negative value for this last pivot time, or at least whether it is 0. And I'll plug an boolean here. And let's go to compile and save. Let's play. Okay. No, still you're holding, but then it get fixed. Right. Okay. But somehow that issue is happen only for the backward, not for the okay, it happened for the forward as well. Let's check the left and right. Yeah, that issue is there. Right. Let me see. Right, maybe what we can do is, instead of relying on this automatic rule based transition, we can add sort of an animation notify state, which is specifically saying where we need to make a transition, right? For example, so here we have this rifle pivot cardinals for forward, backward, left and right directions. So I'll start with maybe forward. So in the forward, we have this sort of a transition. So maybe at the end of this sequence, we can add sort of a animation notify state, which signifies or which actually signals to this animation blueprint where we made a transition, or where we reach to the end of the animation sequence, so that this animation graph can listen to that specific message and make the transition back to the cycle state, right? Okay, so in order to add that thing, what we can do is we can create a notifier state. So at the animations, I'll create a new folder called Anim notifiers, and here we can add Anim notifier. Maybe let's select the class hierarchy and search for Anim notify state. Yeah, let's use this one, and I'll rename this as ins transition to locomotion. So this transition will simply yeah, this anim notify state can be applied for any sort of a sequence to make a transition. So just for testing, I'll add it to this one, which is rifle jog forward pivot. So the notifiers, let's add the notifier, notify state actually. This one, ins transition to locomotion. And you can adjust its width as you wanted. I think this one would be fine. And then you can go to here. And instead of this automatic rule based transition, let's mark it as not automatic, and then let's go inside of it and let's use was anim notify to win source state. This one, compile, and here we can use this one, ans transition to locomotion, right? Do we have any other stuff? Was anim notify state active in instead of using any state, let's use source state pivot, because then we are only reflecting, or we are only listening to these anim state transitions at the pivot state only, right? So let's use that one, and ns transition to locomotion, right? Now let's play test and see whether it's working. Yep, it's working, right? But for now it's only working for forward. If you try the backward, you can see it has some issues, but for forward it works. You can see like backward still has the issue because we haven't explicitly added that to the pivot state yet, for the backward pivot state yet, right? So now what you have to do is you have to go through all of these animations one by one. You have to add that anim notify state, right? So this is sort of a manual process that you have to do, but it needs to be done. Yeah. So I'll quickly add some animation notify state for each pivots. So backward I added, and let's add for left as well, and right. Okay, the jog pivots are done now, so I can test all of those stuff. Right, so forward pivot works, backward pivot works, left, right to left also works, left to right also works. Okay, right, then you have to do the same process for walk pivots as well. So on, so I'll sort of collapse the unnecessary stuffs. Right, so I added to this one, and let's add to backward, and for left and right. Okay, now let's test the walk state. Okay, actually ideally we don't need to add the walk state specific stuff, but yeah, because if we are going to sprint, it will go to the sprint state. Yeah, for now it would be fine. Right, and then let's add for crouch as well. Crouch, crouch pivot, forward, backward, left, and right. Okay, right, then let's resolve the pistol stuff. Yeah, maybe I'll pause the video and resolve those stuff, otherwise it will time consuming. But it's just simply an iterative process that you have to go through each and every individual pivot anim sequences, and at that specific anim notify state at the end of that specific sequence. Right, so I'll pause the video for a while, and I'll make those changes and continue. Right, so I just added a next transition to locomotion and anim notify states for all the respective pivot anim sequences that I specified at DT anim set. So make sure you go through all of these anim sets, namely like unarmed, pistol, rifle, and sword. And we have 3 different movement groups, which are walk, jog, and crouch. And each movement group we have set of pivot cardinals, respective 4 anim sequences for the base directions. So altogether, at most you have to replace, or not replacing actually, at most you have to update like around, I don't know, maybe like 48 anim sequences at most, considering all of these pivot cardinals, right? But if you are using like somewhat duplicated anim sequences like me, then the count will be a bit more or less, right? But either way, go through those pivot cardinals one by one and add these anim state notifier to there. Okay, So once you add those stuff, so we can finally test the pistol, right? So pistol forward to backward pivot is now working properly. Backward to forward also working properly. And right to left. Okay. Left to right also works fine. Okay. And let's test the sword. So forward to backward. Right. Backward to forward. Right. And right to left. Okay. Left to right. Okay. It works. And I see some smaller distance matching issues that we can see, like you see when you do this pivotal transition, it seems like we are sort of sliding on the ground, right? So those are like minor issues that we can resolve later on, but ideally we have resolved that sprinting issue for the pivot states, right? So that's how we make the changes for the pivot Anim overrides, and I'll see you there. Thank you.